On June 6, 1944, the world's largest aircraft armada backed and shielded the landing ships carrying the invading Allied ground forces of Operation Overlord as they motored toward the beaches of Normandy. German fighters were kept out of the skies by a covering umbrella of American and British planes, despite the presence of medium-level clouds. To bomb and strafe German fortifications and gun emplacements on the shore, squadrons of Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers and fighter bombers flew low over the beaches. Just before H-hour, large groups of Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers dropped their bomb payload on German gun positions. The ships that had transported the troops over the English Channel were overtaken by a stream of transports pulled by gliders. Loads of American and British paratroopers were dropped off at the drop zones surrounding the village of Saint-Mère-Église earlier that morning by those same transports. The United States 9th Air Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Louis H. Brereton, provided the transports, fighter bombers, and light and medium bombers. Committed ground assistance. The 9th Air Force was established especially to assist the ground forces whose fate was to battle in Western Europe, along with the British 2nd Tactical Air Force. By June 6, 1944, the 9th Air Force had been in combat for over 2 years and was in the second phase of its colorful history, while the D-Day landings marked the beginning of the final and most well-known chapter of its wartime duty. In addition, the role of the 9th Air Force of Normandy and Western Europe was completely different from that of the multi-purpose U.S. Air Force in 1942 and 1943. The Army Air Force was tasked with conducting strategic bombing missions and providing assistance to British soldiers in the Middle East. As a result of Allied responses to enemy activities in many places of the world, the entity that became known as the 9th Air Force was created in a relatively indirect way. The Allied Combined Chiefs of Staff made the decision in early 1942 to view the Middle East and the Far East as interdependent theaters of operations, with resources to be distributed according on the military environment of the time. Since the Middle East was traversed by the established aviation routes from the United States and Europe to the Far East, it made sense to think of the two regions as one when it came to emergency reinforcement. Given that they were on opposite ends of the huge Asian continent, combat forces and aircraft could be hurried from one area of operation to the other. As a result, after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the Japanese got the upper hand in Burma and China, ruling out planned heavy bomber operations against Japan. In response to a new threat, the War Department chose to stop some of the combat forces that were headed to China in the Middle East. The Afrika Korps were fighting the British Eighth Army. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's recent advance in Libya and western Egypt, together with the ensuing threat to Cairo and Palestine, was at least partially responsible for the decision. Aquila and HALPRO. Colonel Harry Halverson oversaw a unique operation called the Halverson Operation, or HALPRO for short, which was the first American air unit to operate in the Middle East. The original purpose of HALPRO, which consisted of a squadron of consolidated B-24D Liberator bombers, was to act as the core of a heavy bomber force stationed in China in order to launch a strategic bombing campaign on the Japanese mainland. Aquila, another group commanded by Colonel Caleb Haynes, had already reached India with a few Douglas C-47 Skytrain transports and a few Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers for the same reason. The plan was for these two forces to unite and attack Japan. President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the bold attack on Japan by Army B-25 Mitchell medium bombers from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet prior to the arrival of the heavy bombers. More than 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed as Japanese troops attacked every place from which future airstrikes against Japan could be launched, making the raid a disaster for the Chinese, even though news of it was perceived as a way to boost American morale. The areas where the bomber bases were being built were occupied by Japanese troops, depriving the B-17 and B-24s of an Asian mission. The Aquila B-17s were eventually ordered to Palestine as well, and the HALPRO force was stopped in the Middle East. Major General Louis H. Brereton was appointed commander of the newly formed Middle Eastern Air Force, and his approach to the position was even more convoluted than the establishment of his new command. On December 8, 1941, Brereton, one of the Air Corps' highest-ranking officers prior to the war, was in the Philippines, having recently taken over as commander of the Far East Air Forces. 2 weeks later, Brereton and his headquarters were sent to Australia to coordinate an Allied air campaign against the Japanese. And President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill decided to leave the Philippines to their fate. After just a little more than 2 months in Australia, Brereton moved to India in March 1942 to assemble and assume command of the 10th Air Force, a brand new unit intended to operate in the China-Burma-India theater. Additionally, Brereton's time in India was brief. He received an order to assume command of American aviation operations in the Middle East in Cairo in June. Additionally, he was told to bring all of India's transports and any bombers that might be available. The relocation included the B-17s of the former Aquila project, the 9th Bombardment Squadron. Deliveries of the 4-engine bombers to the Royal Air Force immediately began when Major General George Brett, following an inspection mission of British Air Forces in the area in 1941, suggested that the long-range B-24 Liberator was the best heavy bomber for the Middle East. One squadron of Royal Air Force Liberators was in service in Palestine by the middle of 1942, when the first American Air Forces arrived. The air staff resisted the British proposal to send American heavy bombers to the Middle East as soon as America entered the war, arguing that doing so would interfere with the planned development of a heavy bomber force in Britain. A calculated attack on Ploiești. The War Department changed its mind and decided to create an air force in the Middle East, with 1 heavy bomber group, 2 medium bomber groups, and 6 chase groups in response to the evolving military conditions in Egypt and Libya. Originally titled the Middle Eastern Air Force, Brereton's new command was intended to be renamed the 9th Air Force, after all required troops arrived at the theater. President Roosevelt gave Army Air Forces Commander General Henry Hap Arnold authorization to stop the covert HALPRO force in the Middle East, as the situation in China worsened, destroying American plans for an air offensive against Japan from Chinese bases. Arnold intended to deploy the B-24s to launch an attack on the Ploiești, Romania oil refinery complex, which was one of the most crucial targets in the ETO and the biggest source of all German oil and gasoline supplies. Although the operation against Ploiești, which was conducted on the evening of June 12, 1942, had little impact, it was notable for being the first strategic American bombing mission of the war. The 9th Air Force was returning to Ploiești. Following the initial Ploiești mission, HALPRO continued to operate as the OHL Squadron in support of the British 8th Army against Rommel's Afrika Korps at Lydda, Palestine. Its B-24s and the B-17s of the 9th Bombardment Squadron served as the foundation for the future 9th Bomber Command. The 2 squadrons formed the 1st Provisional Group, Bombardment, on July 20th. Only 28 heavy bombers, 19 B-24s and 9 B-17s were part of the merged Hall and 9th Squadrons. The B-17 strength stayed below a dozen aircraft, despite the fact that the number of Liberators would rise. Together with the RAF Liberators, the American bombers attacked objectives in North Africa and along the Mediterranean coast, as well as Axis shipping in the Mediterranean. Due to their limited range, the B-17s were only able to carry out missions as far west as Tobruk, whereas the American and British Liberators hit targets as far west as Benghazi, Libya. In late July, the 344th Bombardment Squadron arrived as the advance element of the 98th Bombardment Group, en route from Florida to Palestine, providing reinforcements for the Middle Eastern Air Force. Along with members of the 57th Fighter Group, the 1st American Fighter Group dispatched to the Middle East and armed with Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighters, the 98th Group headquarters arrived by ship in mid-August. In the meantime, the 12th Bombardment Group's B-25 medium bombers sailed up via Central Africa to their new base in Egypt after crossing the South Atlantic. Before engaging in battle in North Africa, the 57th Fighter Group and the 12th Bombardment Group trained alongside the British. Operation Torch preparations. Although the number of heavy bombers would double, the first comprehensive War Department plans for air power in the Middle East were never fulfilled, when recently promoted brigadier. General James H. Doolittle, who had gained star status in Washington due to his Tokyo raid, pressed Arnold to give him the 33rd Fighter Group for his new 12th Air Force. Political scheming cost the Middle Eastern Air Forces some of their anticipated assets. The formation of the 12th Air Force was taking resources away from other groups in order to support the American landings at Casablanca. Since the majority of the air staff thought that air superiority over the Western Desert would be advantageous to the overall success of the Allied operation in North Africa, there was a mixed response to the request in Washington. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was to lead the invading force, was given the final say in the matter by the War Department. The 30th proceeded to the 12th because, of course, Ike wanted to be in charge of the group himself. The War Department decided to send the 79th Fighter Group to the Middle East to replace the 33rd and to address the need for P-40s in Egypt. The 79th did not become a combat unit until the spring of 1943, despite the fact that the group arrived in October and many of its pilots performed combat missions with other units. The Middle Eastern Air Force heavy bombers were obliged to rely on the RAF for support, or to fly it alone to their targets because they lacked their own fighter escorts, as the 57th Group P-40s were collaborating with the British Western Desert Air Force. Brereton's bombers operated both during the day and at night, because he was not constrained by the need to validate American notions about daylight bombing, unlike Generals Ira Eaker and Carl Spaatz, who had traveled to England to plan a daylight bombing campaign. Compared to the bombers of the 8th Air Force flying daylight operations over Western Europe, losses among heavy bombers operating in the Middle East were very minor. The heavy bombers were hitting targets all around the coast of North Africa with significant success. At Mediterranean ports, sticks of bombs dropped on warehouses next to the docks, and some ships were struck and several sunk. The B-24s struck and destroyed an ammunition-laden ship at Benghazi on the evening of September 22, 1943, severely damaging the harbor's infrastructure. Since the fortresses lacked the range to reach Benghazi from their bases in Palestine, the liberators bore the brunt of the task. In the attacks on Tobruk, the American B-25s and British Vickers Wellington bombers were reinforced by the shorter-range B-17. In the pivotal engagement of the North African campaign, the British 8th Army faced and routed the Afrika Korps at El Alamein prior to the arrival of American ground forces at Casablanca in early November. The RAF had about 1,000 aircraft of all kinds in North Africa before the fight. There were 56 P-40s, 46 B-25s, and 63 heavy bombers in the U.S. Army Air Forces, 10 of which were the war-weary B-17s that Brereton had transported from India. The Axis Air Force was greatly outnumbered by the Allied Air Force. On the Eastern Front, where the Germans had been struggling since the previous winter, the Luftwaffe was pinned down. The 57th Fighter Group's P-40 pilots performed admirably in El Alamein, the U.S. plane's first major engagement. They battled German and Italian planes in the air and joined RAF P-40 fighter bombers in fighter-bomber strikes on German sites. 19th Bomber Command. The Middle Eastern Air Forces were not formally organized until the summer of 1942. Although it was still in an unofficial state, the 9th Bomber Command was staffed in October. Brereton's staff, Colonel Patrick Timberlake, criticized British claims to command of the American heavy bombers, claiming that this went against deal negotiated between General Arnold and important British officials that called for homogeneous American formations. American heavy bombers comprised 4/5 of the heavy bomber power in the theater, although Timberlake acknowledged that it could be suitable for the U.S. fighter and medium bomber groups, of which there was one in the Middle East at the time, to operate under British authority. Following Timberlake's memo, the British consented to the creation of an American Bomber Command in Cairo and even gave it command of their own Liberator Squadron. The new IX bomber leadership was put under Timberlake's leadership. Lieutenant General Frank Andrews assumed command of the U.S. Army on November 8, 1942. Middle East Army Air Forces. The top U.S. Andrews, an Air Corps commander and local Army officer, had his own views on Air Force organization, which were gaining traction in the overseas commands. Andrews issued a general order creating the 9th United States Army Air Force, with Brereton as its commander 4 days after taking over theater command. Brereton activated IX Service Command and IX Headquarters Squadron that same day. 2 weeks later, on November 27th, 9th Bomber Command was formally constituted, though it was already operating in an unofficial capacity. The British 8th Army started moving westward into Libya, with American forces landed at Casablanca. The 9th Bomber Command set up forward bases immediately west of Tobruk and relocated its bases from Palestine to the Nile Delta. IX Bomber Command now had 2 complete groups of B-24s after the first provisional group was reorganized on November 1st to become the 376th Bombardment Group. With new aircraft arriving from the United States, the remaining members of the HALPRO force were bolstered and replaced by more staff. Although there was still 1 squadron of B-17s in the command, they were unable to work efficiently alongside the Liberators due to their slower speed and shorter range. 3 groups of heavy bombers. 2 B-17 units departed the 8th Air Force in England following the Casablanca landings and relocated to North Africa to join Doolittle's 12th Air Force. 3 of the 93rd Bombardment Group's 4 squadrons were temporarily assigned to North Africa in December to support 12th Bomber Command, one of 8th Air Force's 2 B-24 groups. After completing a few sorties from Algiers, the 93rd relocated to Western Egypt to join 9th Bomber Command, which would be using identical B-24's Ds. The 93rd's arrival gave IX Bomber command of 3 heavy bomber groups, a powerful force, and allowed them to start assembling large formations. Since the B-25s of the 12th Bombardment Group were remained in British control, the IX Bomber Command was left with an all B-24 force after the 9th Bombardment Squadron and its B-17s left Egypt for North Africa and the 12th Air Force in exchange for the 93rd. 9th Bomber Command focused on German targets in Tunisia during December and the first part of January. The B-25s of the 12th Bombardment Group, which had previously been commanded by the British, joined the B-24s in attacking Crete on January 2nd. As part of the 9th Bomber Command, it was the medium bomber's first mission. Only 12 of the 36 Mitchells that were supposed to take off were able to do so, and one of those turned back before reaching the target due to an early dust storm. 2 Mitchells were lost on the return flight, but 11 Mitchells bombed their objective. Due to excessive fuel use, the majority of the others had to put down on different fields and were unable to return to their home base. The promised 79th and the 324th were 2 more fighter units that had reached the theater by January. The new groups had P-40s, just like the 57th that came before them. The 316th, a troop carrier group, assigned to the 9th Air Force, was initially supposed to be sent to a project in the Caucasus. While the troop carrier transports went to work, transporting supplies for the fighter and bomber squadrons and providing support to the British ground forces, the fighters continued to combat alongside the British. One of the troop carrier's main missions was to evacuate injured by air. Europe is the target. 9th Bomber Command focused on targets in Europe, particularly Naples, Messina, and Palermo after capturing Tripoli. In the Axis supply chain to Tunisia, the 3 cities played a crucial role. Although they staged out of a forward base at Gambut near Tobruk, where the bombers were refueled before leaving for the lengthy sorties to Sicily and Italy, the B-24s were still based in the Nile Delta. The B-24 units proceeded 300 kilometers to Gambut, Maine in late January, leaving the Nile Delta. The 8th Air Force and the 93rd Bomb Group went back to England, but they would soon return. In anticipation of the impending invasion of Sicily, the 9th Air Force focused on reducing enemy defenses and logistical hubs after the Allied victory in Tunisia. 9th Bomber Command Liberators accompanied 12th Air Force B-17s in attacking Sicilian airfields and other installations, as well as targets in Italy. To aid with the invasion, a few B-25s from the 12th Bombardment Group were assigned to the 12th Air Force. 3 8th Air Force B-24 groups were added to 9th Bomber Command in advance of the landings. The 44th and 389th groups, as well as the veteran 93rd, which had spent the winter with the 9th Bomber Command. The three units made up the entire Liberator strength of 8th Bomber Command at the time. In support of the impending invasion of Sicily, the new units joined the 98th and 376th in bases near Benghazi, Libya, and took part in raids on objectives. 12th Air Force B-17s and B-20 forces from 9th Bomber Command, augmented by 8th Air Force units, attacked railroad marshalling yards near Rome on July 19th. There were two reasons for the extra B-24s from England to arrive. The most ambitious plan of the war, a low-level attack on the Ploiești oil fields, the same target that resulted in the assignment of the HALPRO force to the Middle East, was the primary reason for their presence, in addition to the fact that they were there to boost heavy bomber strength in the Mediterranean for the Sicily campaign. 5 B-24 groups left Benghazi on August 1, 1943, and headed for Ploiești across the Mediterranean. Under heavy enemy fire, the B-24 swooped in treetop level over the refineries. Although some of the groups hit targets other than what they were given, the majority of crews were able to place their bombs inside the refinery complex, despite suffering significant fatalities. The operation was less successful than anticipated because of a navigational error on the part of the lead formation, which prevented some of the B-24s from bombing their targeted targets and prevented the majority of one group from bombing the refineries at all. The United Liberator Force hit the Austrian aircraft industry at Wiener Neustadt less than 2 weeks later. Combined bomber attack. The Army Air Forces underwent a significant restructuring in anticipation of the Normandy invasion when Allied forces landed in Sicily and Italy. The Allied leaders decided to launch a combined bomber offensive against Germany from British and Italian bases during the Casablanca Conference in early 1943. Plans were planned to establish a second force that would strike targets in Germany from the south, with the 8th Air Force in England serving as the American Strategic Bomber Force's northern arm. Headquarters of the U.S. 8th Air Force served as the model for the new headquarters. The purpose of the Strategic Air Forces was to oversee heavy bomber operations against Germany. The idea to create tactical air units specifically for ground support was influenced by the performance of the RAF, 9th, and 12th Air Force fighter bombers, as well as light and medium bombers in supporting ground forces. As a result, the 9th Air Force was sent to England, where it would serve as the American Tactical Air Force in charge of assisting with the ground operations in Western Europe after the Normandy landings. 2nd Tactical Air Force was created as a parallel to the RAF. 9th Bomber Command's 2 B-24 groups joined the B-17S from the 12th Air Force to form the newly formed 15th Air Force, while the 9th's fighter and medium bomber groups moved to the 12th Air Force, which had been assigned the same mission in the Mediterranean in anticipation of the move. As early as May 1943, plans for a distinct tactical air force in England had been formulated, with the 8th Support Command serving as its original headquarters. Plans were quickly formed to create an Air Force-level entity completely distinct from and equal to the 8th Air Force, although the unit initially appeared in planning files as the 8th Tactical Air Force. Since plans were already in place to transfer the heavy bombers to the new 15th and roll over 9th Air Force assets in the Middle East and North Africa into the 12th Air Force, General Arnold offered General Brereton command of the new organization on July 31st. Brereton was the most widely experienced general officer in the United States, having served in 3 theaters and multiple significant conflicts. Army. After meeting with Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, the then top U.S. officer in England, he left for the United States on September 10th to meet with Arnold and take a brief leave of absence. By mid-October, Brereton was back in England. Only the headquarters of the 9th Air Force and the IX bomber, fighter, and service commands would travel to England, according to the decisions made by the Army Air Force's leadership throughout the numerous deliberations. Units arriving from the United States would make up the majority of the new Tactical Air Force, while 9th would receive its initial combat and service units from the 8th Air Force. England's 9th Air Force. The 9th Air Force became its first operational forces in England on October 15th, when 2 troop carrier groups and 4 medium bomber groups moved from the 8th. The troop carrier groups flew Douglas C-47s and the 322nd, 323rd, 386th, and 387th Bombardment Groups used Martin B. 26 medium bombers. At a time when U.S. fighter squadrons in Europe were outfitted with Lockheed P-38 Lightnings and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, the 354 was the first fighter group to join the new 9th Air Force. Their arrival in England was a turning point in the air war because they were carrying North American P-51B Mustangs. To prepare the recently arrived pilots for combat, a number of pilots from 8th Fighter Command, notably Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, were temporarily posted to the 354. They launched a campaign to assign 8th Fighter Command to all upcoming P-51 groups because they were so impressed with the aircraft. Due to the success of their campaign, by the middle of 1944, the majority of the 8th Fighter groups had acquired Mustangs, and the P-47s they had been flying were being transferred to 9th assigned groups. Only 2 fighter groups equipped with Mustangs and a reconnaissance group were ultimately sent to the 9th Air Force, despite the original plans calling for more P-51 groups with the 9th. With the exception of 3 units that were outfitted with P-38s, every other fighter group flew P-47s. Military politics, which appeared to be common in the European theater, led to the P-51s being diverted to 8th Fighter Command. General Carl Spaatz returned to England in late 1943 and assumed command of the U.S. The new command, Strategic Air Forces, Europe, was established to supervise U.S. Germany was the target of Army heavy bomber missions. Spaatz quickly exercised the authority that came with his new title and position as the top Army Air Forces officer in Europe. He aimed to command all American aviation forces in England, particularly the 9th Aviation Force. Since the new Tactical Air Force's objective was to support the ground fight with dedication, Brereton and Army Air Forces planners had envisioned it as a separate command from the Strategic Bomber Forces. Spaatz was furious when he learned about the scheme. He did not want another Army Air Forces command to operate on what he saw as his own territory. As he was the top air officer in Europe, he took preventative action by sending Brereton a forceful letter in which he made it apparent that he would be in charge of the 9th Air Force and that he would serve as the liaison between the 9th Air Force and headquarters U.S. Army Air Forces located in Washington. Already, Brereton and his staff were beginning to suspect that Spaatz was favoring the 8th Air Force over them. The commander of the 9th Air Force was unable to contest the senior commander's authority, since Spaatz was superior to Brereton in both military rank and command power. Although Arnold ultimately agreed with Spaatz, a number of senior officers in Washington believed that it was a mistake for a strategic bombing organization to have command of an air force tasked with assisting ground forces. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower temporarily resolved the issue by bringing all of the aviation units under his direct command as the D-Day landings drew near. Eisenhower ordered that until the Normandy beachhead was formed, all air operations, including heavy bombers, would support the ground forces. Under the 8th Air Force's command, during the 1943 to 1944 winter, the 9th Air Force was expanded. 3 light bombardment groups of Douglas A-20s and 4 additional medium bomber groups of B-26 were added to strengthen 9th Bomber Command's 4 B-26 groups. Providing troop carrier support for ground and airborne forces would be one of the 9th Air Force's responsibilities, and expanding IX Troop Carrier Command was a top priority. Only a few weeks prior to D-Day did Troop Carrier Command meet its intended size of 14 groups, including about 2,700 gliders, as the training and equipping of troop carrier groups in the United States had reached saturation. Subsequent events demonstrated that this was insufficient since the advancing ground and air units' requests for troop-carrying aircraft outstripped supply. The fighter force building proceeded more smoothly. 18 fighter groups, including night fighter and reconnaissance squadrons, totaling about 1,500 aircraft, were assigned to the 9th Air Force by May. The fighter strength was split between 2 tactical commands, with the 9th Tactical Air Command, TAC, receiving the majority of the fighters and the 19 TAC, which was tasked with supporting General George Patton's 3rd Army, receiving 2 wings totaling 7 groups. The 9th Air Force's fighters and bombers operated basically under the 8th Air Force's command for the first few months of its operations out of England. Évreux-Fauville Airfield, a Luftwaffe base located about 50 miles west of Paris, was the destination of the first 9th Bomber Command mission. While the Luftwaffe left the B-20s alone and continued to target the heavies, Spaatz thought the medium bombers would distract German fighters traveling to Germany from B-17 and B-24 formations. In order to train for the crucial role of providing close air support for the ground forces once they were ashore in Normandy, 9th aircraft were diverted to escort missions. Over France, the 9th Air Force. On December 1, 1943, a 28-plane formation of P-51s conducted a sweep over northeastern France, marking the first 9th Air Force fighter mission. 4 days later, the 354th Fighter Group flew to Amiens with bombers on its maiden escort mission. The new P-51s accompanied P-38s from the 8th 55th Fighter Group on the longest escort mission to date, a 490-mile journey to Kiel on December 13th. In February, the B-26 of the 9th Bomber Command performed their first double mission day while concentrating on V-weapon installations. During Big Week on February 24th and 25th, the B-26 hit German airfields in Holland and V-weapon installations in France as the heavy bombers entered Germany. In order to prepare for the impending invasion, the B-26s began attacking German transportation targets in the middle of March, but attacks on buzz bomb launch locations persisted throughout the month. The 9th Fighter Command started attacking targets on the continent with fighter bombers in the middle of March. The 9th and 19th Fighter Commands had been created for this purpose, and on May 20th, the 9th Air Force began to refer to its units not as fighter groups, but as fighter bomber groups and squadrons. Fighter bombers hit airfields, railroads, bridges, V-weapon launch sites, railroad marshalling yards, and pretty much any other target that would make it harder for the Germans to reinforce their forces near the beaches of Normandy. The fighter bombers engaged the Luftwaffe in air combat when the opportunity arose. Covering the beaches on D-Day was primarily the mission of the 9th Air Force. 5 groups of P-47s were to maintain high cover, while British Spitfires were to give low cover. The ships would be flown by P-38s. 4 aircraft from 8th Fighter Command joined 2 groups of 9th Fighter Command, P-38s for the mission. Just before the forces reached the shore, 4 P-47 groups and 2 additional P-38 groups were tasked with striking gun batteries. After bombing German heavy gun batteries on the beaches, the 11th A-20 and B-26 groups struck bunkers behind Utah Beach. The air battle was renamed a 9th Air Force and 2nd Tactical Air Force show starting on June 6th. The main objective of the Air Forces was now to support the troops on the ground, even if the Royal Air Force Bomber Command and the 8th and 15th Air Forces continued their strategic bombing campaign against German towns and industrial targets. And they provided support. In fact, General Patton began to consider the 19th Tactical Air Command's fighter bombers to be his flank defense. As he planned the audacious strikes for which he is renowned, Patton began to rely significantly on the fighter bombers and viewed the 19th Tactical Air Command and its commander, Brigadier General O.P. Wyland, as belonging to the Third Army. Encouragement of the Normandy breakout. The 9th Air Force had a new commander after August 8, 1944. Since Brereton had overseen Billy Mitchell's paratrooper plans during World War I and had previously worked with American paratroops, his transfer to command of the newly established 1st Allied Airborne Army was a fitting one. Lieutenant General Hoyt P. Vandenberg succeeded Brereton as commander of the 9th Air Force and would lead the 9th until after VE Day. When the Allied ground forces eventually emerged from the hedgerows that had been holding them back, 9th Air Force P-47s played a significant role in Normandy. In addition to their 8.50 caliber machine guns, the P-47 pilots were equipped with rockets, bombs, and napalm. They would fly down to just over the treetops and attack anything that moved on the little French roads and agricultural lanes. Later, German officers would blame the lethal fighter bombers' incredible power for their failure to stop the Allied landings. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada's 9th Tactical Air Command crossed the English Channel to new airfields, scraped out of French soil close inland from the beaches shortly after the Normandy beachhead was secured. The German 7th Army's soldiers and vehicles were the fighter bombers' targets, and the forward airfields got them within a few miles of them. The fighter bombers were given their own name by the Germans. They were known as Jabos, which is the German word for a fighter bomber. Thousands of German tanks and other vehicles were destroyed by American P-47s and British Hawker Typhoons. Because the fighter bombers couldn't find them in the dark, the Germans began moving at night because they were so feared. From the Ardennes offensive to Operation Market Garden. As the advancing troops emerged from the beachhead, the 9th Troop Carrier Command also took on a role never seen before. On D-Day, Troop Carrier Command carriers braved heavy enemy fire to drop their troops close behind the beaches before bringing in reinforcements and supplies. Troop carrier transports hauled in the fuel that kept Patton's Third Army moving as they moved far beyond their ground lines of supply when they started rolling across France. When the availability of C-47s became an issue, B-24s were separated from the 8th Air Force and deployed to the IX Troop Carrier Command for missions delivering goods, especially gasoline, into France. This was because air transportation of supplies for ground forces became so crucial. Some aircraft carrying cargoes of gasoline for Patton's trucks and tanks made trucking missions and landed on newly taken Luftwaffe airfields, particularly during Operation Market Garden, when B-24s airdropped supplies to American and British paratroops in Holland while suffering heavy casualties. Liberators were laden with ammunition and supplies to be airdropped to ground elements. When the European winter descended on Belgium and the Ardennes forest in late 1944, the Germans capitalized on the weather, which is the primary drawback of relying on air support, to mount the most successful counterattack since the Allied breakout from the beachhead. The area was covered with snow, fog, and low clouds, making it impossible for 9th Air Force fighter bombers to fly. The 101st Airborne Division, besieged by German forces and cut off from all land supply channels, nearly perished at Bastogne due to the terrible weather that made aerial resupply impossible. The 9th Troop Carrier Command saved the day when the weather cleared, before the paratroopers ran out of food and ammunition. As the weather improved, fighter bombers from the 9th and 19th Tactical Air Command were able to attack the German soldiers, the majority of whom had become stuck after running out of gasoline for their vehicles. The Allies might have lost the Battle of the Bulge if not for the 9th Air Force and its equivalent, the British 2nd Tactical Air Force. The 9th Air Force, the future of combat. One of the biggest ironies of World War II is that the 9th Air Force's style of combat was the way of the future, whereas the 8th Air Force was rendered obsolete as soon as the Allies won in Europe. The fighter bomber idea has endured through the jet age, but almost all of the B-17 and B-24s that survived the war were reduced to scrap metal in a matter of years. The most potent weapons in contemporary combat are high-performance jet fighter bombers.